changing collective meaning. All the places that I'll talk about today are relatively new. They've been constructed or sort of created over the last 20 years or so. So you have to realize there's a period of many decades there where the places I'll talk about are just kind of normal sites in the cityscape, a parking lot, a vacant building. And it takes, again, all of this tremendous effort to then turn them into these incredibly symbolic and meaningful spaces. Okay. Before I get into my examples, I want to highlight 3 points to sort of think about all of these. The first is the question of authenticity. All of the places that I'll talk about today are places that people would consider to be authentic sites. That is, they're memorials built on the site of specific events that happened during the Nazi era, rather than being built in some central location. As an example, the topography of terror that I'll talk about in a minute, which is the site of the former Gestapo headquarters and which you read about in the piece by Brian Ladd, that is a so-called authentic site. The museum is right there where these events really took place. The Holocaust Museum, where I'm currently a fellow, is in a sense not an authentic site. It's not on the original location. That doesn't mean that it's not powerful, that it doesn't convey lots of information, that it doesn't play an important role. But with these sites in Berlin, the question of authenticity is often very important. Authenticity is also very powerful, and I think many of us have had some sort of experience where being in an authentic site really actually means something. It could be maybe a battlefield, it could be ground zero at the World Trade Center, it could be a concentration camp, but that sense of being in the real place really does often convey a particular meaning, and such places do seem to carry a particular intensity with them. But that feeling we get, this intensity, this feeling of authenticity, it doesn't come from the walls or from the soil or from the bricks. It comes from all of this social activity. It comes from people talking about a place, learning about it, doing research about it, and conveying this information to other people. There's nothing intrinsically powerful about the site until people start talking about it. Particularly in the case where decades have passed, where the number of eyewitnesses starts to dwindle, and where these memories are being conveyed to people who have no firsthand experience of the events themselves, right? Many of us today, we could walk by the World Trade Center, we would know what happened because we were at least alive when it happened, if we weren't in New York. But most of us could walk through Berlin and have no personal experience of what happened between 1933 and 1945. So as time passes, these ways of conveying elements of the past to people who have no personal memory of that past become important. And in Berlin, the preservation, the marking, the protection of these authentic sites becomes one way to do that. Obviously, there are many other media, history, interviews, literature, painting, all kinds of ways of conveying these elements of the past. And the sorts of memorials that I look at are one of those ways of kind of communicating that past. So that was my first point I wanted you to think about. My second point, again, this may sound obvious, but memorials come from somewhere. As I mentioned earlier, they don't just sort of appear out of nowhere. And we have to understand memorials themselves as historical artifacts, as the product of debate, of complicated social processes, and not simply as the reflection of past events. Any memorial site is filtered through all kinds of layers of interpretation, all kinds of political interests and motivations, different approaches to pedagogy or to the most effective ways of conveying information to people. So any memorial in Berlin and elsewhere, we need to approach not simply as a direct representation of the past, but as one interpretation of that past. Any memorial is wrapped up in these kinds of questions of politics and economics, as well as the memories of the actual events themselves. And I also found in my research that what people think of as worth remembering and the ways in which they choose to do it also change over time. And one chapter of my book tries to kind of cover some of the changes in the ways that people have represented elements of the Holocaust in Berlin's landscape. And you really see a marked difference between, let's say, 1947 and 2004. Different styles, a different sense of what kind of scenes to be told, a different sense of audience even. So sort of placing memorials in time is also important. And again, I think many of us have probably walked by some memorial site that seems particularly outdated, even around here. I teach a class on sort of memorials in a more international context, looking at Rwanda, Bosnia, Berlin, and then also looking at some sites in the US. And my students in that class asked me about the equestrian statues all over Milwaukee, right? Sort of some bronze horse on some street corner. You know, you can walk by it and it doesn't really change your life and it doesn't really convey a lot of information. But at some point that was very important to someone to put that horse up on that street corner. And the other thing I told my students was that I bet if you wanted to call attention to that horse, if you wanted people to suddenly become aware of whatever it was that it was marking, try and take it down. And then suddenly there will be public discussion up in the newspapers, and it'll sort of come back into public awareness. That may not last very long, but these kinds of places, even rather dull equestrian statues, sort of fade in and out of public awareness, depending on all kinds of other things that are going on. Okay, and my third point, before I get into my examples. Memorial sites often include messages about how people are supposed to behave. And debates about memorials and memorials themselves are really ways of linking the past and the future. And this isn't something that I myself discovered, but that many people who talk about memorials also find. That as much as it seems like a memorial site is really about the past, it's actually, in many ways, much more about the future. It's about passing on information to future generations in a kind of permanent way. And they're often about instilling some kind of moral lesson, some kind of historical awareness in people who encounter these memorial sites. And that's, again, part of why when you look at them, you can also ask, who built this? Why did they build it? Who was the audience when it was constructed? And it's easy to not ask those questions when you encounter a memorial, but I think it can also be important to do so. And there's a book by a fellow named Kenneth Foote, I don't know if you've come across, called Shadowed Ground, I think, and he does a marvelous job of talking about that and how it functions in the United States. Okay, so those are the sort of overarching points that I want us to keep in mind while I talk about these examples. So I think now I'm going to move into the slides. And maybe lights. Oh. Yeah. Do you have a little flashlight? Excuse me for 1 second. We didn't give you much notice. I know, I didn't think. Oh, wonderful, thank you. Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, so I'll show you examples of how these things operate in Berlin. 3 ways that people have gone about marking particular events from the Nazi era in the urban landscape. My first example is Bebelplatz. I can't see anymore, but has anyone been to Berlin and been through Bebelplatz? A few people, okay. it's very hard to see what I'm talking about here. There's no obvious memorial, but I'll show a picture of it in a moment. This is a square in the center of the eastern half of Berlin. And on any given day, tour buses pull up, people take pictures, clusters of students stand in the square and peer into a small glass window, next slide please, set in the paving stones. It is a site in a busy part of the eastern half of the city, as I just said, just off a main road and across from one of the main universities. All kinds of people walk by it every day. Until 1995, relatively recently, no one would have stopped here except to park their car. So what is everyone looking at, and what is being remembered here? May I have the next slide? There, in that little cluster. On May 10th, 1933, a group of students burned books in this square and in similar squares all across Germany. They burned books that they considered quote-unquote books by Jewish authors, books by communists or socialists, or even people who they somehow deemed contrary to the Nazi ideology. This was, again, May 10th, 1933, very early in the Nazi regime. And in these book burnings all across Germany, no one was physically injured directly, but this marked a serious shift in German culture and marked this moment when we could really see this growing acceptance of Nazism, and many people saw this as kind of a harbinger of things to come, this burning of ideas of diversity in these squares all around Germany. But, of course, the events themselves left no lasting mark. After the war, the square was used as a parking lot. In other words, decades passed when no one thought to use the square in any other way. In 1983, the 40th anniversary of the book burning, the East German government put a plaque on a nearby building, and a few years later they started talking about putting a monument in the square. In 1989, nothing had really yet been done, and the wall came down. Plans for the square shifted a little, but there was widespread agreement that this site should be marked, and an increasing sense that parking here was inappropriate. Many people agreed it was important to mark the authentic, original site of book burning, and that a memorial should serve as a reminder and a warning to people about what happened on this spot. Remember what I was saying about this link between memorials and the future, and this project is definitely about, at a time when there was kind of increasing xenophobia and violence against foreigners in Germany, the decision to build this memorial was very much linked to this vision of a way of reminding people about the past and reminding them to work to prevent the repetition of those kinds of events. Can I have the next slide? So a competition was held in 1993, and the winner, Micha Ullmann, an Israeli artist, developed this unusual memorial, and this is what everyone was looking at in the last slide. It's just only not much bigger than the top of this podium on the surface. So Babelplatz today is home to the square of glass, revealing an underground room painted white and lined with enough bookshelf space to house the burned books in this underground library. And you can just barely make out there, I think, some of the shelves. Ullmann, the artist describes his memorial in the following way. He says, the work is composed of a subterranean, hermetically sealed room in the middle of Babelplatz. It represents a library whose walls are covered in shelves of white plastered concrete. 20 books would fit here. He says Einstein formulated that energy is matter times the square of the speed of light, or the opposite. Matter, books, in connection with light, fire, is transformed into energy. Ullmann says, only the spirit of the books and the people remains. They meet each other in the heavens, which is this reflection you can see on the glass. Near this library are bronze plaques set into the paving stones, which include a quotation from the German poet Heinrich Heine, who wrote in 1820 that, quote, this is just the beginning. Wherever books are burned, people are burned too. And so they have those plaques near this memorial, and then also a little bit of historical information about what happened there. The site has become a very stop for tour buses, for school groups. It really conveys a lot of information to people who come and visit it. And when we think that for decades it was only a parking lot, there's this sort of major transformation that happens because of people lobbying for these kinds of changes and agreeing to fund it and discussing it and the artist designing it. But even when there's so much agreement and so many people agree that the site is so important, there can also be controversy. Next slide, please. Is that a little out of focus? Or is that just me? Could you try to focus it just a little bit? There we go. Thanks. And you can see some evidence of controversy on the sign hanging on the building. It says Bibliothek statt Tiefgarage, library instead of underground parking garage. And the opera is right next door here, and so the opera director wants to put a parking garage underneath the square, and Micha Ullmann, the artist, and many other people feel that that would kind of desecrate the atmosphere of this memorial, that it would sort of profane it again to have all this parking there. And I keep reading the newspapers to find out what has happened, and the debate is on now for years. And there'll be a very firm declaration that a decision has been made and the parking garage is going to be built, and then it falls apart and political pressure increases to not have the garage built. So we'll see what happens. But I think that's another thing, that it's easy to forget sometimes that memorials also have kind of afterlives. Once they're constructed, then they have to deal with being in a living, changing city. And so sometimes memorials do, sometimes parking garages do get built. Just as a memorial can appear where for decades there was parking, sometimes memorials can also be threatened by other new projects in cities. Could I have the next slide? Great, just another shot of the banner there. But still, it seems fairly certain that this site will remain, or not, there's actually parking underneath it, and that it's been a fairly successful way of anchoring a piece of history and a warning to people about the dangers of xenophobia and racism, anchoring these messages to this visible and very central part of the urban landscape. My next example is one that you read about in the piece by Brian Ladd for today, The Topography of Terror. This is a site that marked the former Gestapo headquarters, and so one of the major centers of Nazi power and Nazi violence. While Bebelplatz sort of showed us the very beginning of Nazi power, the Gestapo headquarters, the Topography of Terror, shows the sort of full-fledged operation of Nazi power. This is now an outdoor museum. Can I have the next slide? That has been created here at the site, again, of the Gestapo headquarters. You can see the museum over on the right, sort of just slightly below ground level. Here, the Gestapo detained people, not in these cellars themselves, but in nearby cellars that are actually still covered. The Gestapo detained people and tortured them, and also oversaw Gestapo activities throughout Europe. The buildings themselves were damaged in World War II, and then torn down in the 1950s. Next slide. Leaving the lot looking something like this. It might be difficult to imagine using the former Gestapo headquarters for anything normal, but for decades, the site was just an empty lot in the middle of the city, used as a place, as you read, used as a place to practice driving a car without a license, and as a place to pile up debris from nearby construction sites. Certainly, people with personal memories did not forget what had happened there. You can imagine it being difficult for survivors or perpetrators to walk by this site without remembering what had happened. But most people forgot or never knew what had been on this site, and it just kind of faded into the urban landscape. This is part of what I found in my research, that in many cases it's very possible for places where horrible things happened to fade from view, and to fade at least from public awareness, certainly not from the memories of people who were eyewitnesses. But sometimes someone who I call a memorial entrepreneur sort of engages and decides to really work to bring the history of a particular place into broader public awareness. And that's exactly what happened here. After decades of the site kind of fading, kind of a memorial entrepreneur or a set of memorial entrepreneurs came along and began working to make this history more visible. Next slide. And this slide actually shows the change from a pile of construction rubble to archaeological digs and protests in favor of some kind of documentation center. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, again, as you read in the Brian Ladd piece, a few local professors, students, and other activists began to call public attention to this site, staging a symbolic excavation in the early 1980s and calling for some kind of exhibition. Next slide, please. Eventually, as you can see here, more extensive excavations were conducted. Next slide. And an exhibition was built. You can see the entrance to it here. You can also see, does anybody recognize what's right next to the entrance? Yes, the wall, the Berlin Wall, just happened to run right along the side of former Gestapo headquarters. So an exhibition was constructed here, which was supposed to be temporary, and is still there. Let's see, I'm adding up how many years later, 17 years later. It's changed since then, but we'll see in the next example as well. The next example has an exhibition that was supposed to be up for 4 weeks in 1999 and is still up today. So there's really this process where once a site is marked and comes into public awareness in this way, it's very hard to imagine going back. After this exhibition was opened, it becomes very difficult to imagine opening up this land for development, let's say, or selling it to a developer. Let me show you just a few more images of the site. I know there were a couple pictures in the piece that you read, but I'll show you a few more. Next slide. This is, I'm sort of walking into the entrance. Next slide. And as you've read, this exhibition was intended to be very kind of historical and very much about documentation. They simply show all kinds of historical evidence about the Gestapo's activities, about the rise of Nazi power, about the victims of the Gestapo, about resistance to some extent. Next slide. And there you can see there's just, if you wanted to, you could really spend quite a long time here learning, looking at a lot of text, a lot of images, a lot of maps that talk about both the specific site, next slide, as they do here, and next slide, and the sort of broader web of Nazi power throughout Europe. Next slide. There. And one more slide. These are some of the people who were killed by the Gestapo, not always here at the site of the headquarters, but often up in a prison. Oh, sorry, in Plötzensee, exactly, yes, up in the northern part of the city, a site that is also a memorial. Next slide. And there you can really get a sense of how it's below ground level. The exhibits are in the cellars of part of the building. There's the Berlin Wall sort of falling apart right behind it. And the building in the distance, not even very far away, the building above, is the Reichsluftfahrtsministerium, the former the Nazi aviation ministry that's now used as a government office building. Next slide. And there you can get a sense for the way that this museum is located in the city. It's up on the right-hand side. You can see that sign I showed in an earlier slide. So you're just walking through the city. On the right is a museum, so maybe you're going to a museum. On the left is the State Assembly House, so maybe you have something you have to do at the State Assembly House. But you can walk down the street and suddenly be confronted with all of this information about the Gestapo, about the Nazis, right in the center of the city. And it really serves as a reminder that this wasn't something abstract that happened somewhere else. It happened right here in the heart of Berlin. As you can see right here, the Berlin Wall did run along one side of it. And for decades, because of that, this lot was really on the edge of West Berlin. I'm sorry, I don't have a map to show you, but so when the wall, or most of it, came down, suddenly that became the center of Berlin. And so these kind of real estate pressures that I was talking about really increased after the wall fell. Even though the topography of terror, this former Gestapo headquarters, was in half of the city, with the wall there, it was basically in the outskirts, in a sense. Nobody was particularly interested in that plot of land. So there were some concerns when the wall came down that the land might become so valuable that it would be very difficult to resist trying to sell it to the highest bidder. But that didn't happen. And I can talk later, if you want, in a little bit more detail about how that worked. But it has remained this kind of open-air museum. May I have the next slide? Just another view of it. And one more slide. Okay. This is the back entrance. So again, if you're walking down the street going to, I think there might be an Italian restaurant up on the right, you also then happen to be walking by the former Gestapo headquarters. And that was very intentional. The people who designed the museum and the memorial site wanted it to kind of interrupt escape. Wanted to make it difficult for people to ignore this element of the past. And we have to remember that in Germany, for decades, there was not a lot of discussion about the Nazi past. And there was not a lot of kind of confrontation with that past. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there began to be much more. And so this was really a key site in reminding people to think about this past and also to prevent these kinds of events recurring, and to remind people about the importance of things like human rights. Next slide. Even though this has now become probably one of the most widely recognized and most important sites connected to the Nazi past in Berlin, even here there continues controversy. Next slide. In this case, there's supposed to be a documentation center constructed on part of the site, and it's completely stalled. It's been stalled for years. There are very ugly arguments about who's going to pay for it. The director of it, I believe, recently quit. So as much as it feels like, of course, there has to be some kind of a marker on this site, the precise ways that it comes about are often quite difficult, and in a sense, kind of pedestrian too. It's often about the state budget, the city budget, who's sort of willing to pay for what. And so there's no threat to the outdoor museum itself, but there's real doubts about whether this documentation center will be constructed. So we can see there continue to be controversies, even though the actual site itself is not really threatened. Okay. Let me move on to my third and final example. Next slide, please. This is a very different kind of site. It's very difficult to find, first of all, where the topography of terror just sort of appears in the middle of the city. This site is deep in the back of a sort of far courtyard in a building that you wouldn't necessarily thing to walk down. And I'll show you some more pictures in a moment. Also, the previous example really focused on Nazi perpetrators, right? Focused on the site of Nazi power and perpetration. This example turns to a case of resistance. A man named Otto Weid, pictured here, who ran a small workshop in the heart of Berlin in this building, where most of his workers were both blind and Jewish. And he managed to save many of their lives in the early 1940s. Like the other sites I've discussed, this workshop was forgotten for decades by all but eyewitnesses, and you can see the building is really neglected. Really neglected. It's also been used by artists, and that's the thing on the right is this crazy bronze sculpture that one of the artists just put up on the wall. No connection at all to the former workshop. But again, like the other sites I've discussed, the rooms that you'll see in a moment were sort of left abandoned for decades until a few people began trying to more clearly mark this history and doing some research about it. Only in the late 1980s did efforts to put a memorial plaque on the outside of the building begin, and it was only in 1999 that an exhibit actually opened in this space. This is an example where I was actually able to kind of test the theories I had developed about the of memorials in Berlin because I was there as it was being made. I was doing my research mostly in 1998 and 1999, and I had met a number of people involved in different memorial projects, including a city councilman who was the head of a memorial plaque commission. So one day he had a brunch over at his house, and I showed up, and he was there, and some other memorial people, and a woman named Inge Deutschkron, who some of you may have heard of, a book called Ich trug den gelben Stern, I wore the yellow star. So Inge was also at breakfast, and we were talking and eating nice German breakfast, and we decided to kind of pile into a couple of cars and drive into the city center, and I didn't really know what we were going to see, but I just went along. So we get to the middle of the city, and next slide, please. I went to see this exhibit that had just opened called Blind Trust. There you can see the entrance to the gallery or to the exhibit rooms and the poster that had been designed for it. It's hard to tell from the last two slides I've shown, but this is actually in a building at one of the busiest intersections in the eastern half of the city. Most of the structures around it have been renovated. It's packed on any given Saturday afternoon or Saturday night, just people going to restaurants and movies and cafes and clubs. But this one building has been kind of neglected. Next slide. There you can get a sense of the outside of it. If any of you have been to Berlin, the Hackische Höfe is right next door, a huge complex of courtyards and cabaret and shopping and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. Basically the same view. So to get to the exhibit, you walk through that little archway, through one courtyard, then through another courtyard, and then in that door I showed a minute ago. So this little group of us, Inge Deutschkron, the city councilman, Volker Hobrock, and a few other people, we walked through here. Next slide, please. Down the courtyard, next slide. And you can really see the terrible shape the building is in. Next slide. Next slide. So back into this crumbling courtyard. Next slide. Next slide. And these are the rooms where the exhibit, those two windows there and a couple other windows to the left. Next slide. So this is on a different day that I took this picture when they had some different posters up, but we come to this rather unassuming entrance to this exhibition. Next slide. We walked up this narrow set of creaking stairs and into the exhibit. Next slide. So it's hard to imagine, isn't it, from that courtyard that this is what you'll find upstairs. The walls rough and unpainted, the floors bare. And once inside, we stood looking at glass cases full of letters. Next slide. Photographs and objects ranging from a cloth Star of David worn by one of the workers to a postcard sent to the factory owner from his lover on her way to Auschwitz. Next slide. As well as equipment like that was used in this little workshop. Next slide. Otto Weidt, in his efforts to save people's lives, went so far as to march down to a detention center that was right down the street and literally convince the Gestapo to release people that they had already taken from his workshop. And he was able to bring them back. Another thing that he did was use this small room that you can see in the back on the right, next slide, to hide an entire family until they were betrayed by one of their family friends and sent to Auschwitz over 1943. Next slide. Oh, that one's upside down. That's my fault. Could you back up one? And do you think you could turn it over? Am I asking too much? If not, it's fine. It's hard to see. Yeah. I can just leave it on this slide too, that's that line. Okay, thanks. Huh? Uh-oh. Oh, they're doubled. It's fine. We can even, that's my last major slide, so we can just turn the slides off, and if someone could bring up the lights. I still have plenty more to say, but that's my last image. So that small room that you just saw, thank you, was used to hide this family, but that was only one of the many things that Otto Weidt did to try to save people's lives. So this afternoon that we're here in this exhibit together, there are pictures of Inga Deutschkron on the wall, and there's a videotaped interview of her running in a little television set in one of those coal stoves that you saw. And here's Inga Deutschkron standing in this room while her video self kind of talks to us. And I started, they were telling me, oh, this exhibit is up for 4 weeks. It was put together by some museum studies students who had been searching for a project and had found out about these rooms. They went in and did the kind of work that you saw. They renovated a little bit, they put in those exhibit cases, they collected materials, they spoke to some eyewitnesses. They did a lot of work, but it was their thesis project, and it was only supposed to be up for these 4 weeks. And I knew when I walked in there, I said, there's no way that they're just going to take this down and do something else with rooms. And so far, I've been right. 5 years later, it's an official sort of extension of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and it's sponsored by them. But that wasn't a given. It wasn't at all clear from the beginning that that was going to happen, and things may still change. But a couple weeks later, a couple weeks after this brunch where we went to the rooms together, I came back to hear Inga Deutschkron give a reading from one of her books. Here we are sitting in these rooms with folding chairs set up in the exhibit spaces, and Inga sitting at a table reading to us. And I'd say there were 30 or 40 people in the audience. And I could feel this kind of change in people as she read and as she talked. She wasn't just reading about anything, she was reading about these rooms and about hiding and about worrying about the Gestapo coming, about the kind of work being done there, about all the tricks that Otto Weidt had to try to talk the Gestapo into setting people free. All the ways that he was helping other people who were in hiding, the ways he helped her go into hiding. And so she's talking about in these rooms, and you could feel the audience sort of really changing their opinion about these spaces. And the second she stopped talking, there was a question and answer session, and people were just sort of alive with this feeling of the authenticity and the intensity of the space. And they started brainstorming. Just kind of random members of the public, but brainstorming about how to turn this into a permanent exhibit. They're like, who do we call? Let's call the culture minister. Let's call a senator. Let's call the mayor. Let's get these different people to come and visit the site. Let's call reporters so that it gets press coverage. Let's do anything we can to make this a permanent site. And another woman raised her hand and she said, it's like the Anne Frank house. When you're there, you really feel it. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Anne, but it's another one of those places where, at least for me, the authenticity is also quite powerful. You know, you read this book as a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 22-year-old, and then you go to the place, and that has a certain power that it's difficult to reproduce, that it's difficult to create in somewhere other than the actual authentic site. So here people were comparing these rooms and the authenticity that they had to a place like the Anne Frank house. And sure enough, kind of public support, all of that interest in this space changed what is possible in those rooms, changed public opinion so that in a sense that the rooms passed this point of no return. It's very difficult to imagine returning them to just being some sort of storeroom. And there are other elements of this process that I haven't really talked about today. Ownership is a very important question. You certainly need memorial entrepreneurs, active people working to memorialize, but questions of ownership, of land use, and of the resonance of that site with a broader public are also very important. So let me just say a few words in conclusion. First, these sites, I think, remind us that the Holocaust did not just happen in concentration camps, kind of cut off from other parts of Europe. It also happened deep within villages and deep within cities, including Berlin. Second, we should remember, as I think should be clear by now, that memorials come about through complicated processes. And when we encounter them, we should not only think about the meanings they convey, but we should think about who built them and why. And finally, as much as I've talked about the importance of authentic sites today, we should remember too that many authentic places do become memorial sites, but many authentic sites also fade into the landscape. And the city is full of other places where terrible things happened or where very courageous things happened, but that aren't marked. And that's not necessarily to say every last one of them should be marked, but that we should understand sort of the ways in which some places really come into public view and other places fade a little bit more. And this question of why some places are collectively recalled while others fade into the landscape can also be phrased in the following way. We can simply ask, how do groups of people live with collective memories? There are many answers to this question. We write about them, we tell them to grandchildren, we read about them, we ignore them, we dispute them, sometimes we forget them. And we also transform them into concrete places in the landscapes around us. Thank you. I can just take them unless you think it'll be chaos. Okay. Are there any questions? No chaos.
I actually had a similar experience when I went to Paris. We were looking for this one cafe, and we kept wandering around. And it's been years since I spoke French, but I'm still able to read. And we kept coming across, whether it was on the cement floor or on walls or on the outside doorway. And we came across the one about the sculptor hit about 15 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was killed because of that, as well as the kids. But just as emotional.
Yeah.
That's what it does.
Yeah.
And the closest I can say about here is when I went by Donner's Pass and not really recognizing what that story was about.
Yeah.
But I remember looking over the wall afterwards I realized, oh, that was Donner's Pass, and so it's really interesting what triggers what. And for me, it's often an emotional thing. So I don't know. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah. No, I think that's the case for many people, and I think it also reminds us that there are also places even in a place like California where it feels like history is kind of invisible or kind of paved over. That there are some places that kind of anchor memory also. So yes.
During the period in Berlin, the former Gestapo headquarters, people that work around there, and the government building next to it, and the Italian restaurant you referenced, and so forth, and pass it and see it every day, German people, local people.
Yeah.
How do they react to it? How do they deal with it? Is it part of the memory that they consciously forget? Do they trivialize it? Is it no longer important to them, or what?
That's a marvelous question. Should I repeat it? Yeah. Sorry? I would say all of the above. But let me repeat the question so that you in the back could hear it. He was wondering about people who live or work right next to the Gestapo headquarters. What is their Germans who live there, walk by it? What is their reaction to it? Do they ignore it? Is it a part of memory that they try to repress? Or do they sort of acknowledge it and confront it? And I would say that some people, definitely, some people think that it's very important and sort of work hard in different ways to preserve that history, to convey this history, that there's a real spectrum. And many school groups go there. And this is one of the, I think, really important roles that it plays. It's a place for 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds to come and learn about this element of the history. One thing that happens in Berlin is that some people say maybe there's too much memorialization. Maybe there's a danger of numbing people to these elements of the past, or people are like, oh, one more Holocaust memorial. But other people say there need to be more, that there need to be more ways of confronting this past in the urban landscape. So does that kind of get at your question?
We were in Berlin 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I found it difficult to engage people in any kind of discussion, as trivial as it might be, about issues that dealt with things like the Gestapo, the SSS, the Holocaust, and so forth.
Some of that, he's saying that he was trying to sort of talk to Germans about the SS, the Gestapo, and the people were not open to talking about it. Some of that is an East-West issue. Westerners learned about and dealt with the Nazi past in a different way from East Germans. And the ways that East Germany kind of interpreted the Nazi past, as Ladd talks about a little bit too, the West, I mean, not to say that the West is fabulous and sort of has dealt with everything just fine, but especially in the 70s and the 80s, there was more openness and a more open discussion. In the East, there never really was. There was sort of one standard version of the Nazi past and very little debate about it. In the West, there is a little bit more openness, a little bit more debate, and it's also generational. I think that sort of student-aged people may be more resistant now, may feel like, oh, I've had that in school ever since I was 12. I think that people maybe in their 30s and 40s might be a little bit more open, and that the generation older than them might be a little bit less open. That the people in the sort of 40s, 50s were a part of this confrontation with the Nazi past. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really what happened. In 1968, the student movement began in the West, very much questioning their elders still alive, what they had done during the Nazi era, and that brought about a large reckoning with the idea of and books were written about the inability to mourn and so on by Richard Lipton, and a big discussion. And the Holocaust is part of the educational curriculum in high schools. You have to have a whole year in the gymnasium on the Holocaust, but we did quite, in other years, we did quite a bit of corresponding with teachers in Germany, how much they teach, and we got their programs and so on, and they do really a lot. I would say that if you just talk to strangers, it is very different than when you talk to people that are, it's like here, if you talk to people in California about what happened to the Indians, it's very hard to get a good cross-section, but when we talk to people in schools or in synagogues or churches, we get a different, deeper perspective, and people might be kind of shocked that you would ask them about that, you know, if they're not with their friends or colleagues of yours.
Is there another hand? Go ahead.
Yeah. People like Tom Hanks who have been advocating for a World War II memorial here in the United States. Are you aware of some of the conflict regarding that as to, you know, things haven't really been moving forward on that? And might it parallel some of the situations in Germany or France or the European countries?
He's asking about just sort of discussions about a World War II memorial. What they, I think, was it last week or the week before, they dedicated the new one on the Mall in Washington. It's taken a while, and it's, in a sense, it's surprising that it was first built in 2004, but I actually don't know very much about the discussions leading up to it. My hunch is that there was a memorial entrepreneur, you know, that there were people kind of engaged on its behalf, and that there was some open space, as there was for it. So, yeah, sorry, I don't know more. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, yes, might be the memorial entrepreneurs, yeah. Here.
Since we're living in the age of the great political spin,
Mm-hmm.
do people who are putting together memorials in Berlin have concerns that the neo-Nazi use these memorials in ways that they had not designed them to be?
Absolutely. She was asking if people doing memorials today in Berlin have concerns that neo-Nazis will misuse them, will use them in ways that they were not intended to be used. One example I can give is in the early, I think in 1990, in the open space where the wall had been, they were clearing it of mines so that they could have a Pink Floyd concert there. And in doing so, sort of discovered a bunker that was there. I mean, obviously, many people knew it was there, but they unearthed it. And it wasn't Hitler's bunker, but it was the Hitler's driver's bunker. And it was covered in these horrible kind of fascist murals and had furniture left. And, you know, it was really, quote unquote, authentic. And there was a huge debate about whether to preserve it and open it to the public or not. Because obviously this is another site that rose, you know, right here, this is where Nazi power was centered. And, but at the same time, an incredible danger in many people's eyes that it could become a kind of pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. And in the end, the decision was to close it, to photograph it, document it, and to seal it up again. And it was one of the sites that some people tried to turn into a museum of some sort, but that actually failed. So it's an important question. There's definitely vandalism. One of the problems with vandalism, like spray painting swastikas, for example, on memorial sites, it's hard to know, is this a part of a kind of organized, growing right-wing political movement, or is it a rebellious 15-year-old who knows that this is the way that you can really anger adults? And I mean, this is people working in memorials in Berlin say this is part of the difficulty of combating things like vandalism on these sites. Obviously, it can be taken seriously no matter what, but fighting it becomes difficult. So, does that answer your question?
I was wondering the issue of accessibility. So I noticed in the topography of Terra, the signs were in English, they were in French, they were in German. And I'm wondering how much these sites were created with not just authenticity, but accessibility for the expectation of a range of tourists, and whether some sites are going to be more accessible, more multilingual translation, and who's making those decisions, and what the politics might be of that.
That's a wonderful question. She's asking about accessibility of these sites. Are they geared for tourists, geared only for locals, geared for children? Are the materials available in different languages? And Yes, in the topography of terror, there are multiple languages, that sort of sense of openness to tourists. At the Blind Trust exhibit that I showed you here, nothing is in English. It's only in German. So not only is it hard to find, but if once you found your way there, if you don't speak German, you won't be able to read any of the signs. And I think in the meantime, they might have a sort of handout that you can get in English. A friend of mine who's an American leads tours in Berlin, he wanted me to put him in touch with them so that he could translate their sort of captions, but I didn't want to do it because his German wasn't good enough. I know that sounds so mean, but I knew that he wasn't the right person for the job. Their website is in English and German, so I think that they're moving in that direction. But it's a great question, because I've shown you 3 sites. In my book, I talk about a total of about 35 places, and you know, they really run the spectrum from sites that people read about in the New York Times or the LA Times to places that only people in that neighborhood even know about. So there's an incredible range. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you address the contention around a Holocaust memorial that is still not built, as I understand it, in Berlin?
She's asking if I address the Central Holocaust Memorial that some of you may have heard about, sort of right in the heart of Berlin, right near the Brandenburg Gate. That controversy has been going on forever. Not forever, but the discussions about the site began in the late 1980s, I think 88. They decided on the site in the early 1990s. It's still not finished, and there has been controversy after controversy after controversy. One of the biggest questions being, is it fitting to build a monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is its official name? Is there any way that you can use sculpture or sort of art means to somehow represent the Holocaust? And eventually, the sort of political decision was, yes, that is possible, and in some way, or that some sort of symbol or gesture should be constructed in the middle of Berlin. But it looks now like it actually will be completed, but it has not been free of controversy. But I only talk about it as one of many examples, because it actually follows, even though that's probably the monument that happens on the biggest scale of all that I look at, process is still similar. The memorial entrepreneur is still key. This sort of moment of reaching a point of no return also happens. So, Heather. Hmm?
In these discussions about constructing memorials, whether they be as tools for teaching or as memorials to the victims, is there ever any conversation as to the appropriateness of using these funds to build a building vis-a-vis using these same to alleviate suffering in current situations across the world?
There is some discussion about that. And much of the logic behind many of these sites is that some of this work is important for creating a kind of broader awareness that can then lead to people engaging themselves in other projects. And some people would argue that the way that Germany has not been remilitarized is also linked to some of this collective memory. And the Germany's stance on human rights, which is somewhat different from other countries, may be linked to some of these sort of educational efforts. But there is this question, do you spend 10,000 euros, 20,000 euros, or 100,000 on a memorial site, or do you send it into some kind of relief operation? And I think people actively debate this and kind of go back and forth. So, questions? Okay. Oh, I have one more. Yes. That's a fine question. I'm sending it off next month to one publisher, but I'm very willing to have them tell me what to call it. It was called Building Culture. It's currently called Structures of Memory, and I'm just committed to whatever title the editor thinks fits, because I'm terrible at coming up with titles. So thanks for asking. Yeah.
So what do you estimate that it would be out, like it would actually possibly purchase
I hope that in less than 2 years. That's not because I'm such a slow writer. I am a slow writer, but it's because the process takes a while. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, sure.